I guess this is our second meeting at NAMM of the W3C Music Notation Community Group. We had a meeting 2 years ago at NAMM, and then last year we had a dinner but no meeting. And this year we have both a meeting and a dinner, so it's the best of both worlds. And for those, if you haven't seen, there's a dinner 7:30 at Thai Knockhorn in Garden Grove. If you want to show up, just let me know. We have a reservation for 20, and I told them plus or minus whatever. It's a conference, so
Plus or minus 20.
happy to have you.
Plus or minus 20.
Yeah, hopefully not plus or minus 20. A smaller standard deviation than that. So I just want I want to give a little framework for what the Music Notation Community Group is, what we've done over the past year, and where we're going in the next year. Then I believe we will have introductions around the table for people to get people's interest in music notation and specifically where we want standards to go in the future. And then Joe will be leading a discussion of the Mnx project, which is our main focus of activity in the group for next year. So to start, the Music Notation Community Group was founded a couple years ago in July of 2015. We had Make Music contribute the Music XML standard to the group. Steinberg contributed the SMUFL standard music font layout standard to the group. And our charter is to develop and maintain format and language specifications for notated music used by web, mobile, and desktop applications. That includes maintenance of Music XML and SMUFL, but also developing new specifications to handle new use cases and technologies, which is what Mnx is all about. The membership in W3C community groups, you can be a W3C member, and that's great, but you don't have to be a W3C member. You can just join a community group free of charge. And on the handouts there are, I printed out 5 handouts for if anybody didn't get them or print them. I can, if you give me your email address, I can send that to you after as well. But there's our, on there, there's the URL for the community group website. That's also listed on the Tech Tracks meeting notice. So you can follow there, and there you can get more information about the group and also sign up to become a member for those who aren't members yet. So what did we do last year? Last year was a big year for the Music Notation Community Group because we released our first ever official W3C final community report, which was for Music XML 3.1. And not only was that the first report from the W3C group, it was the first update to Music XML since August of 2011. So it's been 6 years since an update to the standard. So we addressed 80 different issues from this open GitHub issue list that we have. The process was fairly similar to what we had in previous versions of Music XML, but everything is transparent and documented, and the community report goes back to the, tells you what all the changes are, and you can then see which specific issues each of the changes addressed. There's major emphasis within the standard on more support for SMUFL within Music XML, but also a lot of documentation improvements, packaging improvements, and fixes for better representation both of musical semantics and musical appearance. And again, there's much more information on that at the community report. The URL is in here. It's also available off of the website for the community group. And then where are we going in the future? Part of what we're doing in for 2018 is to also release SMUFL, have an update to the SMUFL specification as a community report in 2018. But the main focus of the activity will be on our next generation project for music notation representation, which we're using the code name Mnx for, where Mn is music notation and X fills in a lot of different variables, extreme, expanded, extraordinary, whatever you want for your X abbreviation. The goals there are to improve interoperability beyond what we've been able to do with Music XML. We now have 18 years of experience in using Music XML for its use cases of exchange between applications. And a lot of things work well, and some things don't work very well, and some things are really not too good. What can we do to fix up the things that are not working so well for exchange, while also improving, maintaining the things that do work well? But beyond that, and more excitingly, address new use cases for how people want to use music notation in apps. And I think a lot of the new use cases come down to a difference between Music XML being focused on being an exchange format, whereas Mnx is both an exchange format and also better designed as a native format for web-based applications in particular, but other music applications as well. That's something that people are already doing with Music XML, but Music XML really wasn't designed for that. What happens if we start off from the beginning to design something around that perspective of being suitable for both a native format and for an exchange format, and addressing a much larger scope of use cases? So we have an initial draft specification of that. We have some examples and more detail that Joe's will be guiding us through a discussion of. But I think now at this point, we wanted to have folks introduce themselves and, not just what you do, but what your interest is in the meeting and what you'd like to see from music notation standards in the future. What are the gaps that you see in what we currently have with Music XML? What excites you about Mnx? What, if you haven't reviewed Mnx, what you'd like to see in it? If there are things from Mnx that are missing, just a summary of what people's concerns and hopes and dreams are for the future of music notation standards.
Which way are we going to go? We'll go this way.
Start with
Okay, well, I'm Daniel Spreadbury. I'm from Steinberg. I was the guy who came up with Smoothful. I'm one of the co-chairs of the group, and I work closely with Joe and Michael, of course, on helping to shape the Mnx specification, and I have a lot of work started on Smoothful as well. So yeah, that's me. Keep going around.
Sure. Jeff Kellum. I'm a type designer, actually, designing text fonts and music notation fonts, going back to when I first did some music notation fonts in the 80s. But I also have a large technology background. I'm working with the internet and building up protocols in the early days. But mostly my interest is seeing good interoperability, because that's where my background's always been. And hopefully getting a bunch of music notation fonts out this year.
Yeah.
And everybody supports Smoothful, so it'll be easier for me to do my work.
I'm Kevin. I'm an accompanist, and I read music all day of all different types. So I like good music notation, and I write music for groups that I work with. So I've been very interested just in making sure what I write is really, really good. And I enjoy studying, what sort of history of notation and what's current and what looks good to an orchestra, so they'll really enjoy it. So I'm not writing anything. I happen to get on the email list. I love watching the discussion over this whole issue, and it's just fun. I said, I want to see where notation is going, so I'm sort of an observer, but I'm enjoying it.
Great.
Tom Nauman, Director of Publications for MusicNotes.com. Been following this group closely for a long time. Just a huge fan of all the technologies that are spotted around this room right now. Interest here is obvious. I'm not a developer, so I can't contribute too much to the actual spec, but very interested in what's going on here, especially as it relates to web and music delivery. So.
I'm John Higgins. I'm the CTO for Music Notes. I'm a former developer who's now doing CTO stuff. So part of my interest here is that seeing a more widely adopted standard opens up opportunities for collaboration, partnerships with other businesses and organizations. So that's my interest here. Is I think it's exciting to see people coming together and putting these things, a standard together, because internally we see a great deal of potential for the technology. So excited to be here.
I'm Adrian. I run a site called SoundSlice that is has web-based music notation. I'm a developer, and I'm interested in this stuff for real-world solving of practical problems, like people wanting to move things between products and running into dumb issues where this thing is encoded this way and the other program expects it this way. We have an importer for Music XML, and there's just tons of little edge cases that we have to deal with, so I'm interested in the potential for smoothing all of that over.
My name is Derek Lee, and I'm a mobile and web software application developer. Daniel, thank you very much. I don't know if you remember, you helped me out with Smoofle 5 years ago, something like that. It was a while ago. So it's a pleasure to get to meet you. I'm developing applications for drum education, and I used Smoofle with some assistance from Daniel a number of years ago. I haven't been really following, I guess, the last year or two how things have been developing, but I'm really interested to see Mnx and learn a little bit more about where things are going in that regards. So, pleasure to meet everybody.
I'm Philip Rothman. I'm a music preparer in New York, and I have a blog where I try to write intelligently about things I don't understand, like what's going on in this room. In all seriousness, I think it's really important, as everybody stated, for the wider community, what's going on. I am, with the permission of the chairs, recording this for your larger community and in the wider world. If anyone has a problem with that, please do let me know, and I can certainly edit. I've been recording our introductions, but we can edit that out if you have a problem with it. But just wanted to get that out there. Pleasure to be here.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Sark. I'm a developer at JW Pepper. I work on our digital sheet music platform, ePrint. We're very interested in obviously having native web support for music notation. In addition to that, I also am working on Music XML for Google's Magenta project for AI-generated compositions. Right now, they just use MIDI as an input. I've written the Music XML input. Now we need to figure out what to do with that data and get large enough data sets to do something with it.
Yeah.
I am Bruce Nelson. I'm a music engraver, not a developer. I'm fascinated by the movement, what you're doing, pushing forward into a new dimension, off the paper into the web. And I find that very exciting. What I'd like to see added to this is possibly more ability to shape and craft the notation. From being primarily a keyboard engraver for many years, I see notation on the web that is kind of, it needs help sometimes. You know, and I think this new drive can maybe bring some of that too to the fore. So I'm excited that you're kind of drafting another level of code that may be able to do that.
I'm Mark Adler. I'm Director of Production / Senior Editor at Make Music. I also craft and maintain all of our fonts. So that's, and we have a lot of the interest is in how, all of everybody's apps play with Finale and certainly with smart music, and how quickly we can, broaden the funnel into smart music.
Should we detour to the...
Yep. I'm Steve Morrell.
Steve.
I'm on a small new company called Nice Chart that's music XML based, and also not a developer. Here to sort of see where things are directing in that space.
I'm John Brantingham. I run the site artofcomposing.com, and I'm just into notation and composing and software, so I'm just here to listen.
Evan Balster. I've been working for some years on a voice pitch to MIDI transcription software, and my focus for a long time has been on live real-time usage, but a lot of my users are very interested in composing with their voice. So I want to learn more about this end of the industry. So.
Okay, my name is Fabrizio Ferrari. I am the creator of virtualsheetmusic.com, and I'm also a web developer, so I'm really interested in this. And our company has been specialized in specifically in classical digital sheet music since 1999, so a long time. And with the complexity of the classical sheet music, I think I could give good feedback for Music XML, since, what more complex than classical music? So happy to be here.
I'm Simon. I'm founder of UberChord, which is a guitar learning software. So we use XML for the guitar notation. And This year I started working also for Forte Notation, which is a small company in Hamburg where I'm based, and so we do a lot of XML issues in our software. So I'm looking to how things are moving forward. Might make it easier to work with.
Cool. Chris Kazuda, Howlander Corporation. Kind of the base level of what we're interested in is obviously taking the core assets of Howlander, 200,000 plus pieces of content, to the next generation. So Music XML is a very important component of that, as well as just taking it to another level, with potential audio backing tracks in the whole 9 yards. So really just looking forward to seeing this effect continue to mature for that reason.
I'm Doug Laveau. I'm a composer and arranger and producer in Los Angeles. I'm currently under contract to Walt Disney Publishing Worldwide as a producer, singer, songwriter. I've been a music director. Daniel originally called me a music notation enthusiast. I've been involved in the development of Mosaic for Motu, Sibelius with Daniel for 10 or 12 years, and now Dorico. I like to think of myself as a literacy Nazi and feel that the problem with the world today is that too many musicians can't read music. I love well engraved music. I am passionate about it. I know where things go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm Joe.
Or supposed to go.
Yeah, it's supposed to go. You know where you'd like them to go.
I know where I'd like them to go. Where they look nice.
Yeah. I'm Joe Berkovitz. I'm a pianist and composer, and professionally, I've worked as a software developer and architect for most of my life. I founded the company Noteflight around 10 years ago, which was, I guess, the first web-based notation editor. And very recently, as of 2018, I'm no longer employed at Noteflight, but Hal Leonard and Noteflight are supporting my efforts to work on the Mnx project in a consulting capacity. And it's very exciting to be here today and to see how much bigger this meeting is than the last one we had here. And maybe that's linear growth, maybe it's exponential. We'll find out, I guess, next year.
Find out next year. Then we will need that big ballroom.
And it's an exciting opportunity to be able to both kind of take a fresh look at the process by which standards are developed for this community, and also the content of those standards. So the big leap that we made last year was taking Music XML from a company-owned standard, although it was administered in a very open fashion by Michael for many years, to a open consortium administered standard, which has, I think, broadened the process and broadened the dialogue a bit, and there've been some good outcomes for Music XML already from that. And with Mnx, we're trying to kind of take a fresh look at the content of the standards using this fresh process. And the process itself has been honed by the World Wide Web Consortium for quite some time now. It's the outcome of a lot of refinement over the years of figuring out what is HTML, what is XML, what is CSS, what are all these things that we use in our browsers every day. And I've seen, I think, firsthand through my work in other standards groups, including web audio, that having that kind of really inclusive process really makes the standard better, and it also makes the development process of it more painful at times.
Are we
because
moving into the next section?
I
Because I
appeared
didn't
to
introduce
segue.
myself.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just in case people don't know.
I got carried away. Please, Dan.
I should have started because that would
I
have
kind
made
of
a
assumed
perfect segue.
I invented an
totally
introduction
blew
for
it.
you that you never actually gave.
Well, let's hear it,
Without
Joe.
further ado.
But,
Who is
for-
this
for-
man?
For folks who don't know, I'm Michael Good. I'm VP of Music XML Technology at Make Music. I started Recordare in 2000 with the purpose of bringing Music XML to the digital sheet music world. In some cases, it has succeeded beyond my wildest dreams in terms of being universally adopted. In other areas it hasn't, because the original goal was to be, you know, a consumer format, that you would buy your music once and you could use it in any application. Like you could buy an MP3 and you could use it anywhere. You could buy sheet music and use it anywhere, and that hasn't happened yet. So can we do something to make that happen more in the next generation standard? Can we take the lessons of the past 20 years and do something better, and not just get hung up with, oh, hey, this is my baby, I don't want it to change. But you know, if you don't disrupt it from inside, somebody else is going to disrupt you externally. And we've looked at, you know, what's happened with the W3C going from HTML to HTML5, which was a very painful process. Came out on a good side now. MIDI is going through a similar thing with trying to get to a high definition protocol, something that's higher resolution and more expressive than MIDI 1.0. And that is still a painful process, and we don't know what the other side looks like yet. Taking those as examples. And musically, I also am a singer in opera and symphony courses. So, back to Joe.
And the perfect segue.
So, sorry about missing your intro. So, as far as the next bunch of discussion goes, I've been a bit torn, and that's borne out by the makeup of this group, which is partly technical and partly people who really love and care about and rely on music notation and engraving and the tool set that makes that happen for them. And I want to avoid shortchanging either group, so it's going to be a little bit of a balancing act. And I don't want to lose the opportunity to hear about people's desires and needs. But because we're talking about essentially a specification rather than a bunch of applications, right? We don't know where the application world is headed exactly. And what we're making here is, we hope, an encoding standard that will support and nurture the kind of applications we want to see. The discussion will sometimes sort of have to take a leap of faith of, you know, oh, well, if we did this in the standard, what would that encourage in the development community? So we, you know, this work involves approaching the standard from both sides. There's some internal thinking about how can we clean it up, make it well structured, a nice piece of software architecture, a nice piece of data design. And there's also, well, thinking from the outside in. We all use tools, or we sometimes imagine tools that we wish existed and don't. What stands in the way of those things happening, and are those obstacles things that an improved or rethought standard could address? So, so this will be sort of a somewhat messy, stumbling discussion at times, but I'm going to try to use the handouts and the structure of the spec so far as it stands as a way to kind of guide us through that discussion. So let me just start with a little bit of a summation of where we are and what we've got. You know, what is Mnx? First, it's hydration.
And if folks didn't see, there is a water dispenser outside the room.
So it has three parts, and I'll start with the part that's probably the most familiar and accessible to most of the folks here. Part of it is a component called CWMNX, a little of a mouthful there as an acronym, but we want to acknowledge that what Music XML does today, and it's something that's essential for most of us here, is actually limited to a certain musical culture, conventional Western music notation. It's a period in time. It's a part of the world. It's not all music, all notated music everywhere. And in the context of talking about the worldwide anything, it's important to, you know, acknowledge where there is actually a cultural focus and you're not being universal. So that's why we call it that. But what it really is the next you could think of it as the next generation of Music XML. It's the thing that we hope will take the place of what would have been Music XML 4, but will apply some improvements that we hope are worthwhile for the community. So that's one big chunk of it, CWMNX. And it's not going to be entirely unfamiliar to people who know Music XML. It's going to have many points of overlap. A second piece of this is kind of a new idea that emerged from discussing how could we also have a format for encoding music notations of arbitrary nature that aren't necessarily Western music, where we don't know the vocabulary of symbols in advance, where we don't know what techniques a composer may have employed, or perhaps it's the written music of a culture that that hasn't been computer literate and doesn't have a lot of software tools developed for it. So where can the group play a role in allowing that kind of music to be encoded? And as we thought about that, it emerged that there was a role perhaps for what we might call a literal format that encodes a linkage between arbitrary graphics and sound, which is something that a lot of applications are doing today anyway, but without the benefit of a standard. So if you can link arbitrary vector graphics and sound that gets made in terms of time and relationship, you've got something that not only is broader than just Western music, but it actually covers a lot of uses of Western music notation pretty nicely too. We have applications today where people are viewing scores and there are page turns and they hear the music, or it can tell what they're playing and tell whether they played the right note or not, we hope. Or there's a lot of applications for Western music notation that could use this more literal format where you may not know that this mark is a quarter note, but you know that it's connected to this pitch at such and such a moment in time, at such and such dynamic. So that's called GMNX, and that's kind of a new thing. It doesn't have an analog in Music XML. Although, if you think about the apps that people are building today for musicians, there's lots of use cases that this touches on. The third piece, I'm not going to talk that much about it today because it's probably in the crudest state, is called the Mnx Container, and it covers the need to package ensembles of files together in a way that reflects their relationships in a kind of a compound document. And there are a few different dimensions to that, like, it could be movements, it could be, parts versus score, it could be an anthology or a folio. So Music XML sort of doesn't, it has some small bits that deal with that, but that needs to be better built out in the future. Those are the three big chunks. As I mentioned, the other sort of big difference is that there is a community group, and all of you can join. Who here isn't part of the W3C
Yet.
group? Yet.
I will be
Okay, I
today.
love the yet.
I will be
So
today.
please do join. And once you join, what that means is you'll be part of the group that can engage in the discussion, and all of our stuff is online at GitHub, so all of the discussions relating to issues and problems to be solved takes place there. You'll be part of that. There's also a commitment that goes with it, which is important for the W3C, sort of the open standards principle, which is when you contribute an idea to these discussions, you're implicitly making the IP in that idea available to the group for kind of open licensing, royalty-free licensing. So that's an important thing to understand if you work for a company that has proprietary IP. You want to be careful about what you contribute, knowing that you put an idea into discussion for the spec, you're basically relinquishing the right to make money off that idea. But hopefully you're gaining something from building the ecosystem up and allowing that idea to fan out and take root in other people's software besides yours. So
You don't relinquish the right to make money off of the idea, you relinquish the exclusive right
yes,
to make money off of the idea.
That's right.
And you
That's a
empower the
very-
right to make money off of a widespread implementation of an idea, which raises
That's
the market.
very well said.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
I don't want my boss to hear that you're relinquishing the power to make music, make money off of an idea.
Yeah.
I'd be out of here
I don't
very
think we want
quickly.
that. We don't want that. Any questions so far? So just to step through some of the big arguments in favor of, to some extent, starting again, why do we need Mnx? So Music XML was created at a time when print was still king. Well, maybe it still is, but it predated the direct digital delivery of music, which is something that we all understand is really central now. And as soon as you introduce that into the world, as I found when starting to work on NodeFlight long ago, you start seeing a discord between the kind of print-oriented assumptions built into Music XML. A page break will occur here, the credits go there. There's a lot of things that make sense in the print world that start becoming hard to reconcile with a world in which you don't know what the display surface looks like, or where it can take many different forms. So, digital delivery has changed a lot, and Mnx needs to take account of that. We also have a bunch of new use cases. And one of them, maybe the most important one Michael mentioned earlier is if we're going to have, say, web applications that want to work with musical scores coming in and maybe spitting them out to go elsewhere, it really makes sense for the document that they're ingesting or emitting to be as close as possible to a model that application can use for internally representing the music. And so another big design point with Mnx is, can we make it closer to what you would really want a model to be inside a program? It doesn't oblige the program to use it as a model, but the closer that is, the easier it is for developers to create stuff that will just work right away and do what they want. And we've had a few decades to think about how could the things that Music XML encodes be encoded more simply and more straightforwardly.
Could I elaborate on the previous point?
Yeah.
Music XML in particular really tried, not only didn't do something that was closer to an application format, but that was very deliberate.
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, this was 20 years ago where there had been NIF and SMDL, these failed efforts at music
Sure.
notation. There wasn't a community where people would be getting together like this. None of the major players, of course, had any interest in having a music notation standard, so it seemed prudent that the way to get something adopted in a landscape that was littered with failures at this attempt was to really model things on printed music,
Yes.
because printed music was application agnostic, and you would then get over the mistrust between you're doing it the way that Finale wants it, or you're doing it the way that Sibelius wants it, and we can't possibly do it that way. We wanted something that would work well. Obviously, if it worked badly with the formats, it would never have been adopted. But it wasn't. It was very explicitly not what Joe was talking about in terms of being designed in a way that is close to what a notation application wants. But now we have 20 years of experience where, certainly in our company, Music XML is absolutely essential to our business. We've got to get music, as Mark mentioned, into smart music, and Music XML is the way we do that.
It's essential to the entire
Yeah.
music business in
Yeah.
every area of production, conceptualization. Everybody uses it.
So now we have an opportunity, we have that community, we have the success of the new use cases now put us in an opportunity where we can do a format that is closer to an implementation level. And actually, I think, make some progress on it, because I think if we had tried to do that 20 years, it would have gone up in flames.
Climate's different.
Timing's everything.
Yes.
I should say, when we talk about Mnx as a quote-unquote native format, I don't at the present see any browser vendors are going to implement like native support for throwing Mnx into some chunk of your web page and there it is. I think there will be libraries that do that, and they will I would say they'll almost certainly be open source libraries.
Not even GMNX?
No, GMNX is a different story.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the
CWMNX, absolutely.
CWMNX, though, I doubt that there would be. Anyway. And finally, I think that when Music XML began, it was at maybe a greater remove from publishers than we have today. So we've got a lot more interest in publishers in the encoding standards, recognizing the impact that they have on their businesses globally, right? They have a huge downstream effect on what it's possible to package and sell. And so I think there's an opportunity here to have a community that addresses their needs more directly. And I would say Music XML is perhaps a little more, and by necessity, a creature of the software development community.
Can I elaborate on
You
that
bet.
one? That's another story. My first NAMM, I've been to NAMM since 2000, made it every year here. So my first NAMM, I'm going around to everybody, and and one of the publishers, which is not represented by anybody in this room here, talked about this to one of the publishers when we wanted to do with Music XML. Like, oh, that's the internet. We're a music publisher, and we've seen the internet,
It's
and
bad,
we
isn't it?
don't
We don't
like it. We will not cooperate with you. Like, oh, okay, fine. Fortunately, other publishers had a different attitude, including those represented in this room.
Right, and now we have the phenomenon of, is it a publishing company? Is it a notation software company?
Yep.
I'm not sure.
And again, because we have 20 years of success, just as much with the software development community working, we have the publisher community as well.
So where are we now? Not terribly far. We have a draft specification that's I would call it sort of a backbone to what Mnx could be, and it's very far from complete. It doesn't have the same coverage as Music XML yet. There's probably, I think, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of Music XML is not treated yet in this spec, but it's the 2/3 to 3/4 that's mostly Exotica.
More, I think that I would think more that is the same.
Yeah, or
things that are going to be treated very similarly. The focus has been
That's also true.
on the differences.
We'll find out, but yeah, probably you're right, I would guess. But the focus right now has been on roughing out sort of the major outlines of how do you organize the notes and directions and measures, and how do you attack sort of the major design problems in Mnx. So if you look in there and you don't find, scordatura is not described yet, don't be alarmed. It will need to be. There's only a small number of examples yet. There's no reference implementation yet, which I think is going to be a big issue. There's lots of open issues. If you look in GitHub, there will be way more open than closed because the focus has been on capturing them rather than addressing them so far. It's going to shift. And the overall timeline, we're hoping end of 2018 to have an initial community report on a published working draft of Mnx. I think that might be optimistic as far as something that people will then leap to implement, but it will provide, I hope, a benchmark for the next round of thinking, which is, okay, what stands between this and really getting it going? And I think it'll be a milestone release, but realistically, when I think of other standards efforts I've been involved in, I don't think end of 2018, I still don't think the vendor community will be rushing to build it. I do think that there will be implementations, though. They will be, probably anywhere from trial to experimental to much of the way that web standards, before they really are blessed by the W3C, appear in Chrome and Firefox, sometimes not in completely compatible forms. But what everyone's realized is if you don't have implementations, you don't learn. And so you have to have this messy process of, well, let's try it out. Okay, Mnx isn't complete. Let's implement what we can and get it going and see what happens and see where does it fail, where does it stand up. So I do anticipate that even though we won't have this kind of, enormous rubber stamp from the sky, stamping the spec yet at the end of 2018, that could be quite some time. We should have implementations. I hope so. So,
Who would that rubber stamp come from?
that would come from the W3C working, it's called the recommendation track. So, little,
Okay, well, there are two.
there's 2 rubber stamps.
Well, there's the stamp of the publishing it as a community report,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
and then if we want, moving it into a standards track.
Well,
Which
the rubber
is-
stamp from the sky, I think,
Oh,
is the
uh-huh.
recommendation.
Mhm.
The other one is
It's
a
the
rubber stamp from us.
us.
Would that
Yes.
be the actual?
That's right, we wrote
Would that be the
That's the
actual approval
distinction.
of the completed spec?
Mhm. The approval of the completed spec could be done by
By us.
our group. Then there would be another possible process to make this an official W3C standard. Community reports like Music XML 3.1 are not W3C standards, although people don't understand that distinction very well. And
It may not be that important a
Yeah.
distinction either. If browser
Mhm.
implementers are not going to actually invest in, teams of dozens of people
Mhm.
implementing Mnx, it may not really be
Yeah.
worth it.
We
to take
may
that
not
extra
need
step.
the endorsement from the sky.
So we're not working on that part of it now.
Mhm.
That's
No, I
a that's a
Mhm.
separate phase.
Okay.
But we don't expect to see, it's not going to be a final report by the end of 2018.
Right. Okay, in the interest of time, I will treat some things very lightly, especially this container business. So, let me say a few words about it. I will take the liberty of comparing with Music XML just to clarify things. Most Music XML scores are a single run of measures. You can divide things up into movements, and there's something called the opus element that allows you to create a hierarchy.
Which nobody uses.
And I think, so.
Failed.
So Mnx foresees the.
Sad.
Mnx sees the usefulness of doing a better job of representing hierarchies, and there are hierarchies of a lot of different kinds in music. I mean, there's there's movements and there's sections. There's also anthologies in academia. There are compendia of different sources from different manuscripts. There's a lot of different ways in which collections come up, and you can also have alternative encodings of the same work together, placed together for comparison. So we need a way of kind of organizing stuff in some unified way, and that's what the container format is. And it also includes, or hopefully will include, a more solid approach to metadata than we have today in Music XML. So, the metadata world has come a long way in the last couple of decades too, and we want to have a way of encoding where things are from, what their sources are, who they were published by. I know the music publishing business is tangling with some of these same issues at the same time, and hopefully we could get some convergence between what publishers are up to in terms of rights recording and so forth, and what you could say about that in an Mnx file. It would be very nice to harmonize those mechanisms. So,
Metadata has had a fraught history in Music XML. We tried in some versions to reach out to publishers and librarians about metadata and never been able to get traction there. The only effort that really had some traction for doing metadata was open score format, which then didn't get traction overall as a format. So, we provide the framework, but we will need to get participation of the people who are experts in that community to be able to make that happen.
and last but not least, in the container format, you can put actual scores. So if it was just a container, it wouldn't be much use. So in the container, you can put for any sort of you can have these chunks, the score element, and the score element at the moment can be one of two things. It could be CWMNX, which is the sort of Music XML of the future type of encoding, or GMNX, which is a purely graphical plus audio representation of music. but it's extensible. The intent is, you know, future groups, or in parallel, other subgroups could perhaps come up with, you know, medieval NAMMs or Japanese koto notation, or whatever they want to do. Like, it's supposed to be pluggable. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry?
Something that came to mind earlier was the litmus test would be importing Threnody for the victims of Hiroshima.
GMNX can actually support Threnody now. Maybe we'll come back to that. Yeah, to talk about that. Wow.
I had one question. Hello?
She shakes her head and she disappears.
Had one question about the container, well, a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One is that currently this is represented as an XML file, and I've been thinking over the past few days as issues have come on out of the group, perhaps we want to change that into a zip file that has, and the container part is its own XML within the zip file, and then the CWMNX, GMNX, whatever future score types are also XML files within the zip file, so that we can then get images and sound and any other sorts of things all together in one thing. But maybe we want the metadata to be, you know, maybe that should actually be part together with the scores. That's open for discussion as to how that goes. I suspect there will be a need for a zip container, and I should file an issue on that.
You should file an issue on that, and I think that we can have our cake and eat it on that score. Like,
Yep.
I think zip is a way of packaging an archive, but an archive could also be a collection of URLs below some common root, you know, on a web server or something. And so we can kind of, I don't know that we need to legislate the packaging,
Yep.
but that would be a great issue to have.
The other issue I wanted to bring up, especially with all the different folks here from different areas of the industry, is that big ugly digital rights management issue. Because I mentioned the use case of, well, gee, can't we get this in a way that it can be a consumer format? And I don't want to turn this into a whole DRM discussion, but to get the group thinking about, is that something that we want to put in? Our inclination right now has been to not do that, but I don't think that's had a lot of serious thought and discussion, focused thought. It's had some serious thought, but not a lot of focused thought and discussion on it. So
I would recommend against that, seeing what happened when they tried to put DRM into the current W3 standards for HTML5 video. Remember that debacle?
No,
I think we should try
I'm
to
not
avoid
familiar
that.
with
Firestorm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So while
Literally.
individual vendors can implement their own DRM, I don't think it should be part of the standard.
Right. We should not do anything that precludes vendors doing something with encryption or whatnot.
Absolutely.
But I would.
Thank you. That's
suggest
very
this.
helpful, Jeremy.
But certainly, if you go back just a minute to talking about being able to put informational tags, you know, metadata, you know, at the design level. As I move forward, you know, I've been producing stuff for the Walt Disney Corporation since 2008 for 3 different divisions: Disney English, Disney Junior, and Disney Interactive. And being able to identify like a creation and usage history within the metadata has become so important, and so people come and go and leave, you know, and then you're looking at terabytes and terabytes of information and going, where did this come from, and what was the creation standard of it, and how did it get because at Disney especially, stuff gets repurposed all the time and renamed all the time. And so from an educational standpoint, where I was creating curriculum stuff for Disney English in China, they can rewrite an entire curriculum and then want to still know, where did this stuff come from? And when you've got, and on my computer systems, I mean, I've got terabytes of this stuff. So as soon as you started talking about metadata, I wanted to say it should be part of the spec for those reasons in a very open way from the very beginning.
It would be great to know what you know and have that captured in some issues.
Exactly
That'd be
right.
fabulous.
Exactly right.
And when it comes to metadata, one other thing is that MNX intends to allow metadata to be present at any level of the document. So not only describing a score as a whole, but describing a part of the score, a measure, a note, a direction, whatever. It should be possible to attach metadata to pretty much anything.
That would be helpful.
Is that how you're proposing to encode like editorial marks in a score? Like if someone wants to put some notes, would that be a proper use case
That
for
would be
that?
part of it, but we might need more.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
Especially if you need actual elements, to represent semantic music, you couldn't really do that with metadata alone.
I was just talking about like actual text.
Text,
but
right.
yes, adding musical elements would be a different set beyond that.
Yeah, and MEI has some nice features relating to kind of editorial markup or alternative readings, and something along those lines would be really nice to see in Mnx, I think. Okay, so let's see. Now we can talk about CW Mnx highlights, some sort of meaty stuff. Time is 11:24. Okay, let's speed up. We have a new element structure, and I don't know if I want to really get into it in detail, because those who really want that can read the spec. But if you look at the first, example, and just sort of start to scan it, starting from say line 34. You'll see that within a part we have a measure, we have directions that are grouped together, and we have a sequence. And it's kind of this idea of directions and sequences are at the core of the new organization of musical material in Mnx. So Mnx takes what was a kind of a music XML cursor construct, where you had you could really encode notes from measures, especially in a polyphonic or multi-staff situation, almost in any order you wanted, and kind of hop around from time A to time B to a previous time to a future time. And we've sort of taken this approach, and in Mnx, it's much more constrained. Things that occur in a forward sequence that are part of what we think of as a musical voice with non-overlapping events go in an event called sequence, and they occur as elements called event. And an event can be essentially a rest, or a note, or a chord, depending on how many notes are inside it. Like zero notes, it's a rest. One note, it's a chord, it's a note. More than one note, it's a chord. Or dyad. And this cleans up a lot. It eliminates a lot of the concerns with. It doesn't get rid of a cursor entirely, but you no longer have to kind of parse an entire measure's worth of stuff and go back and forth and kind of fill in this data structure if you're consuming the format. Likewise, if you're emitting the format, you have a more natural mapping from the notion of musical voices to what's encoded in there. And directions are a very large class of pretty much everything that's not events. And those are also organized in I think, a slightly simpler way. So in general, directions need to have an offset into some container that they belong to. And that just makes it a little clearer. There's less inference of, oh, I saw these words at a certain point while parsing this musical voice, so the words must be there, must be right at this point. You can still encode it that way, but the more general case is directions just go in their own little batch of stuff somewhere in a measure, and they can occur anywhere throughout the measure. So that new element structure is part of the overall program of Mnx for just making it simpler to encode and decode stuff. Other goals, and this is part where I'd like to get more discussion going, especially with the engravers in the room, because this is going to be a big piece of the problem set for Mnx. Mnx is trying to make a clear distinction between what we call semantic markup, which is saying, say, a quarter note is a quarter note, and it's C and octave 4. You know, it's things that relate to our shared understanding of what that notated object is in a way that transcends how it looks. That's how I would define semantic markup. So Mnx puts semantic markup in a sort of a clear category. This is how we say it's a C4 quarter note at such and such a place. Then there's presentation information, and I'm going to give an informal definition of that. Presentation information is stuff that you might change, that you could get away with changing or even leaving out entirely, and an application would still be able to show the music in a way that a performer could interpret. It wouldn't show up in a place that Doug thinks is right, right? But it would show up, and depending on the job that the application did of inferring some reasonable norms, it could look pretty good.
Right.
So presentation is sort of like the delta between that and the looking really good part. And it's everything that looking right or good entails in a specific context. So it could be fonts, it could be changing, you know, deviations from some sort of standard positioning. It could be size, it could be color, it could be any number of things that are layered on top of what's in the semantic layer.
Got it.
And in Mnx, the stuff we do for presentation is called styles. And that's a conscious reference to the HTML treatment of styles. You know, one of the big evolutions in HTML over the last decade was we went from saying, oh, this text is bold, to saying something like, this text is emphasized. And that's a really big advance, right? Because say for somebody listening to a screen reader, emphasized isn't bold. Emphasized might be louder, right? So people realized, oh, we need to encode what the intent is of the author or composer, and let the thing that's doing the presentation say how that works. Oh, emphasized, well, when you're looking at it, we'll use bold text for that. They could use italics, could use underlining. There are aesthetic decisions to be made. So Mnx is trying to do the same thing here and force presentation information into its own channel in the encoding. So if you look at, I think we have an example here. This example is very unwieldy, but if you were to look at, say, line 109, there's a wedge element, which is a diminuendo wedge. And it says where it starts at the beginning of the sequence, and then there's a style indication. It says, well, we're going to offset the start by 1.2 staff lines, or I forget if it's staff lines or if it's you know, beats or something. Look in the spec, see what it says.
Start offset, end offset.
Who wrote that thing? I think it's staff lines. Anyway, that's presentation information. That's saying, well, rather than leaving it up to the notation program to say where the wedge goes, we're going to like shove it in a little bit so it looks nice. And that's an example of presentation info. And then a third channel of encoding in the documents, a third category, is interpretation. So Music XML has the sound element, which is sort of, and the interpretation piece of Mnx has a similar intent. But I think it's a little more general than sound. It's a place where you can say, irrespective of what semantic stuff sits here, here's how it should be played. And that description of how it should be played is at a low level of description. It's kind of in terms of events. You could think of it as MIDI-like, right? So you could say, well, this squiggle that Bach put in here, in this edition, in this digital edition of the Well-Tempered Clavier, the way that we would like that to be played is, and then you can specify some exact notes in terms of pitches and durations, and not necessarily referring to notated durations either, but literally what should the program play if it's, say, synthesizing the output of this thing for practice purposes. So interpretation is getting a more general treatment in Mnx than it had in Music XML.
Music XML tried to do this by having like besides the sound element, pairs of elements that would reflect what was notated versus what was played. Like the tie element refers to what is played and the tied element refers to what is notated. This drives people crazy,
Mhm.
and it's error prone, and
I can't remember
let's
which
do
is
it
which even
a
now.
clear tied because it has one extra syllable is the one that is the appearance. But
Is that a mnemonic? I never knew.
No. let's make this more systematic and not and get over these problems that people have had with this, because it's important to be able to encode the duality. You know, it's not always a one-to-one correspondence that you can infer on what the performance is versus what is notated, depending on conventions in place at the time of the creation of the music, and people have different interpretations of what the conventions were in place at the time. So it's important to encode that, but there's a better way to do it than what's in Music XML. There are many better ways, and hopefully this is one of them.
Yeah. So, whipping through the rest of the slides so we can get to some good discussion. There's profiles, so you could say, you know, this score conforms to, say, a standard profile, which I hope most will. And the standard profile won't cover every possible thing that you can do in the Western musical canon, but it will cover such a large percentage of it that we think that that's kind of the supported profile that most software developers will probably make use of. And it will inevitably rule out a small number of works, and those works can be handled either graphically or with other profiles that are more specialized. And probably sort of the big standout example is, well, what about multimetric scores with different time signatures and different bars? This is open to debate. I mean, maybe that should be in the standard profile, but it's a debate we could now have, because there will be a difference between the standard profile and some set of more extended profiles that might allow you to encode certain things that would be disallowed otherwise. Because in general, we're trying to tighten everything up and let less room for developers to decide, I'm going to do it this way. We do want to support this idea of house styles. So I talked about presentation, and it's important to be able to say things like, I want all quarter notes to look this way, or in general, I want all staves to be separated by a minimum distance of blah, blah, blah. So this presentation styles business that I described, you need to be able to kind of encode some notion of style treatment across a whole score in a way that could be torn out and say, this is our style sheet, this is our house style sheet. And you should be able to substitute one style sheet for another style sheet depending on context. So this is kind of cool. You know, we've seen now websites that do responsive design where you look at it on mobile, it looks one way, you look at it on your desktop, it looks another way. And we need to be able to do the same kind of responsive styling in music, where you've got a score that if you're looking at it on a phone, it adjusts to that in some way that still reflects the desires of the engraver. Well, now I want to get to the fun part of this, which is the desires of the engraver. So let's say we have these things like start offset and end offset of a wedge. Or we're going to have a style, presumably, that will say, move this note such and so many fractions of a staff line to the right. So that's all very nice, and we can put that in the spec and arrange for applications to ship that info to each other. But does it really matter if we don't agree on to the right of where? So my question to the group is, how far, and this it's also to other vendors, nudge nudge, how far should we go to defining in MNX a kind of a normative standard of positioning for common Western music notation? Like, is that a desirable thing to do? And if we did it, what would the benefits and the drawbacks be? So that's kind of a question for the group. It would result in some standardization of if you don't make there would be a kind of an absolutely legislated default layout for music, which could be tweaked in notation editors, but it would still exist at some level, and that would be it wouldn't force programs to use that internally. You could still use pull up your favorite notation editor and put things wherever you want and never know that this standard exists. But it would mean that when things were exported, deviations in position and adjustments would be with relationship to some pretty hard-edged notion of here's where that note usually goes. So how far can we go in that direction? Is it a good thing?
I mean, the thing is, if we're going to go that way at all, then we have to have norms.
Right.
Because as we've seen with Music XML and its position X, position Y stuff, because nobody can agree what those are relative to, they don't work.
Right.
In the aggregate, they don't work. The same application will interpret those the same way, but other applications don't know and often can't even tell what they were supposed to be relative to because there's no way of defining in Music XML what that position X and position Y was relative to in the
These
first
are
place.
relative X and relative.
I beg your pardon.
Yeah, relative.
Because
It's relative.
Because there is default X and default
Of
Y
course,
that are
that's true.
specific, but
Yeah,
yes,
indeed.
absolutely true for the relative.
So I think that if we're going to do it, we have to do it, and we have to do it quite thoroughly, and so that will be difficult to do because we're going to have to agree on some good defaults, and we're going to have to that's going to be very tricky because even just around this table, there's a bunch of publishers, for example, who all have their own views, and there's a bunch of software vendors who all have their own views.
Right.
And obviously we all kind of think we agree with each other, but actually we don't, not at all, about most things.
No, and I think a big piece of this thinking, an ingredient in our thinking needs to be the awareness that the music we create in a software application may be displayed in many, many, many places by many, many other pieces of software in the future, just as a web page can show up in a zillion places, not just even in browsers, right? So it really, if we want reproducibility in what we engraved, we might need something this definite.
I got a question.
Yeah.
If you don't have those standards, what happens? What's the alternative? Don't
Well,
you have to have a...
Well, so at the moment you can basically
don't
leave
have
it up
it
to the
now.
implementer, right? So the person who's consuming the format, whether it's us in Dorico or Michael and Co in Finale, they basically have to decide.
Have their own.
So
And so
you get it.
apply the standard default layout,
And then we're back to
positioning
Yeah.
from the program and from the individual style that you have loaded up for it, because in any of these programs you can customize your own style, so it then gets loaded into the custom style, and some of these tweaks,
I guess
depending on how the engraving tweaks are specified, some of them don't make it in at all, and others are misinterpreted, and some by sheer luck may actually work.
In a real world example, just as an example of how this has, like I was saying to Joe, then you're back to the Wild West if everybody's, defining their own part of the spec. Daniel and I went to a David Newman session at Warner Brothers on Wednesday, and we met with Greg Jamrock, who's David's orchestrator, but is also a very highly placed orchestrator and copyist at Joanne Kane's office. And, the copyists and orchestrators at Joanne Kane's office are both Finale and Sibelius users, and they're either in the office or spread out as far as Seattle, like Robert Puff's in Seattle, and they're very often having to deal with, as Philip and I were talking about, they don't even use linked scores and parts in either Finale or in Sibelius, because when they get a cue at 10 o'clock at night that's got to be on the stand at the Eastwood scoring stage at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and it's 300 bars long and it's black with notes, they're going to cut it up and divide it amongst half a dozen or a dozen copyists, some of whom are in Sibelius and some of whom are in Finale, and while they've got templates that approximate the same house style and user style, then now what you're doing is you're actually losing some control over quality of work and intention, and also style, the way things are done. And so by having this spec for stylistic considerations in the convention itself, what you're doing is not going back to the wild, wild west of every man for themselves. Did I get that kind of right?
Yeah, that's one case where it certainly comes up. And I want to say that having a standard like this wouldn't mean you couldn't have house style decisions anymore, right? Like you could still encode, hey, the standard spacing for such and such a time interval is this or that. there needs to be lots of variables and flexibility, but there would need to be a model that was followed.
That's right.
Yeah.
So then if you deviate, you at least know.
Yeah.
I wanted to chime in just from a publisher perspective. So, pardon me. You know, from a publisher's perspective, I think just at a high level, we've been trying to get digital to a point of the pristineness of a printed good, right? Lots of nuances, as we all know, right? So we've kind of, you know, from Hal Leonard's standpoint, we dove into Music XML a few years ago. Worked very, very hard to get to that point, but obviously we're not quite there yet, and that's what this group is striving to be. So to get the same control and nuances of print, I think you do need specific kind of, you know, spacing, agreed upon styling and such, because if not, if you have to go back after the fact and do some additional work, from a publisher's standpoint, that's tens of thousands of files.
Oh, yeah.
And you can imagine time and dollars associated with that. I mean, it's, so just to share with the group from a Hal Leonard perspective, we've been converting our assets to Music XML for pretty much 4 years straight now. You can only imagine the hours and dollars associated with it. And we still have customer problems every day with people saying, yeah, but I bought this, and I'm on your website, but it's not quite that. So they notice all those nuances. It's a language, right? It's very refined. So I just hope we can get to some level of agreement and control where it's just fluid and it makes it fun for us instead of a lot of extra work, right? To create kind of the next step of music notation for the young people, for interactivity and such. So
certainly all you have to do from your website to not get what you bought is choose to transpose it into a different key before you download it.
Yeah.
And they'll notice that right away, because how can you possibly?
Yeah, but I think what I'm getting is it's the little elements that people, they notice.
Oh, they
And
do.
They'll bring to your attention. And if we don't
Absolutely.
kind of lock these down now, we're always going to be fiddling with this for years and years ahead. So,
And part of, like, speak a little bit to that as well. I mean, from Music Note's perspective, a lot of ours is inbound. And, you know, it's the things that are submitted to us, everything we publish is in this proprietary package. Music XML is one of the vectors into that package. But everything we import still has to be human and tweaked to be satisfactory for the customer. I think the difficulty here then is deciding on whatever that unit is, that thing, if you're gonna tweak it by this much, what does this much mean uniformly across any of those applications? And I think
Yeah, but even in the case of, like, you know, I think actually the unit's not so bad because we can say it's like staff spaces or whatever.
Percentage of a staff
But it's
line,
like, you know, when we're saying a wedge is going to be offset, from where? Is it the left-hand side of the note head?
Yes.
Is it the center of the note head?
Yeah.
Is it, you know, some
Arbitrary
other
event
nominal
center or
position?
something?
Exactly. So,
Well, let me just add this part too. So, sure you guys know this. So, Hal Leonard publishes its own stuff, but has thousands of partners. Okay, so if we do a content deal with someone and we give Music XML files, as you guys know as well, we don't want to give them messy files or things they all of a sudden they get and they say, hey, that's not what I wanted, and they have to do extra work. So you see kind of the spider effect, right?
Yeah.
So everybody knows here, but just it's food for thought as we decide to really lock these elements down or not, and just kind of the downstream repercussions from it.
I mean, I think if it's good, I think it's simple really. If it's going to encode positioning information, we have to lock it down.
Yeah.
We have to agree. And that is going to take a long time, but we have to do it. And, you know, we're going to have to, but I think it's going to be, in order for the presentation stuff to work, that it has to be completely black and white for an implementer.
It's gonna lock it down
what
for
that-
once and for all.
You bet.
What that
Yeah.
offset is relative to.
That's
Because
what the
otherwise,
point is.
it's going to continue to be messy, and it won't be predictable. And one of the things that, you know, we've been very clear about, I think, is that we want there to be only one way. If wherever possible, we would really like there to be only one way to encode something. And that means that we, just like we say, well, sequences have to go start to finish. You know, you can't go backwards in a sequence. We've got to then say positioning is relative to a known location for every
And
element.
there would
that
need to
could
be an algorithm in the spec
Yeah.
that says how it works.
That's right.
One
Yeah.
of the things too, I think that's important too, that is a current shortfall in the system is basically people focus on the import. They want their import to be good. They don't want their export to be very good. They don't want it to leave. And sometimes that export has less attention paid to it than the import. And if there's any way to incentivize the export being handled to give all this valuable information too, so that it can be imported into something beautiful.
Kickstarter fund.
Yeah.
Import and export are very, I mean, it's like consumer-oriented orchestrators, copyists, in and out, in and out, in and out. You got everybody using a different platform. Their DAWs or different platforms. It's like in and out have got to be equally, you know, they have to work equally well.
When we have widely, so when we have widely adopted, free, probably open source viewers available everywhere for MNX, that's the biggest incentive to create a good export. It's like, hey, who wants to create badly formed HTML that a browser won't be able to look at? Nobody. Nobody wants that. Well, it happens. But there's an incentive. There's a built-in incentive.
You know, when you say, and it happens, it's because maybe someone didn't say what Daniel said, you know, at their meeting.
Well, I mean, of course, yeah, the thing is with HTML, you know, it's because it's sort of mostly text-based, if we're generalizing, you know, horribly generalizing about web content, then, you know, we sort of all know how even right-to-left text goes, generally speaking. But you can't make the same kinds of basic assumptions about the layout of music at all, you know, as you can for text. So even poorly formatted HTML, browsers can do a great job of formatting them, but implementers will have no hope of doing anything sensible with MNX data unless, you know, they either basically have to say, right, well, presentation data doesn't work, and we don't use it, and we do what we do anyway. We do our default
or only
thing,
some
or
of it works. Yeah.
Or we have to close the surf completely so that it can be completely described.
Yeah.
Can I throw a quick?
Yeah. By the way, we only have 10 minutes left for GMNX, so.
Actually, we have 5 minutes left in the whole session.
Oh.
The whole session?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Because there's another group coming in at 12 o'clock.
All right. I need to say something quickly about GMNX, and then we could have free for all if there's any time left. GMNX is a graphics plus media type of format. So the notation in GMNX is really, at the moment, it's just an SVG file. That's all it is. It's vector graphics. And you could throw a raster image in there too if you wanted. And musical sound or performance is one of two things. It's either an audio file, like, you know, an MP3 or WAV or whatever you like, or it's a MIDI-like list of timed events, you know, pitch, dynamics, start, end. And there is a technique for linking the time relationships of these two things so that you can support a pretty wide array of interactive applications that don't need to know what notation really is, beyond the fact that you can look at it and that it highlights maybe, or there's some cursor over it in relationship to what you're hearing. So many practice performance applications don't need more than that. And they don't need to load up a whole rendering engine to like figure out how to turn, you know, the concept of a quarter note into a quarter note shape. Like, it's enough to just have the shape and know where that shape lives on the screen. So GMNX targets that. If you want to look at the set page, it's the second example in this, and really the first 20 lines of this are enough to understand what's going on in it. Just in a lightning look at this. It's page 1 of 4 for GMNX Viewer. And this score consists of an SVG file, that's the score view element, and then there's some performance data, and you'll see lower down, there's slews of performance events that are sort of MIDI-like things that provide enough information to actually play the score through a synthesizer. And then there's the performance mapping element that describes how such and such a time range in the performance event timeline corresponds to some region in the SVG score, and it corresponds linearly in this case. Like there's a rectangle in the graphics that corresponds smoothly to a time range, and as time progresses, you can count on that correspondence applying linearly across that sweep in the graphics file. you might object that music notation isn't really linear, but actually even common Western, complicated notation can be broken down into many tiny slices of approximately linear mapping. So this does work fine for even very complex scores. And because we have so little time, I'm not going to demo it, but if you go online and check out the demonstration viewer that actually parses this format crudely, there's one example of foray. There's an example of Hebrew cantillation, which is completely non-Western, right to left. It's like something completely different. And there's an example of Ludoslavsky's Second Symphony, which is aleatoric, and bars kind of come in at sort of times up to the performer, so there's multiple cursors progressing at different speeds. So kind of a nice test case, and I think Penderecki Threnody would also work fine. So maybe you'll do that one as a test case. Supply and encoding.
Deer in headlights.
Yeah. So anyway, I think that's actually got some current exciting prospects for being applied, possibly sooner than CWMNX, because it's much simpler. It's really a very, it's a pretty stripped down format. So that's GMNX.
And
yes.
What about the use case of performance data, basically sync points?
Yeah.
Fantastic, but like for my product, I'm not dealing with SVGs. I actually have a renderer.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I want the sync points from this, but in I forget the acronym. CWMNX. What do we do?
I guess we can put that in the performance element somehow, right?
So there would be a space for that.
I think so. Right? We could find a way of.
That's a really interesting point,
Yeah.
and I hope you'll file an issue and we'll think about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not ready with an answer.
Sure.
But I hope there's a way to do that. Yeah, I mean, NoFlight could probably benefit from that too.
Sure.
I've got kind of a question about long-term intent, which is if this group is interested in eventually seeing the names, the Mnx namespace as something that could just be embedded in HTML and viewed in a browser.
Totally.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Like I imagine that's probably a ways off, but like the math namespace or the SVG namespace being inlined in another data.
It'll have a namespace immediately, and it'll be viewable, I would think, in a browser as soon as there's a decent JavaScript library that supports it.
Cool.
There's room out there for somebody to do that.
Yep. I don't know if they're beating down the doors yet, but we're allegedly
Well,
supposed to be vacating
we need
the
to
room
leave,
now
I guess.
to make great. Thank you, everybody, so much for coming.
And thank you,
Thank you to
Michael, for
Philip
organizing this.
and Jeremy for getting me started. Jeremy did a lot of the work on getting this going. Thanks to Philip for videoing, and the conversations will continue. See many of you
See most of you
for
tonight.
dinner.